Hello, BookTube. Well, it's a bleak and barren Sunday here at Hyde Cottage. And for those of you who might be new to my channel, that's my self-pitying term for Sundays, when I get no free books in the mail, when no books come for Steve. And I have to make do with the paltry, inconsequential number of books I already have here at the place. And to console myself, I usually do a tag, and I have a good one on the MacBook right now. I was tagged by none other than Olive at a Book Olive. Now, I'm assuming that you all subscribe to her already, but I'll put a link to her video just in case you have overlooked that. And the tag is the Around the World book tag, which was created by Liz at Book Learning, and it's broken into 3 parts, all revolving around travel. So I thought we'd get right into it here. Part number 1 is getting ready. I have done a fair amount of traveling, and getting ready was always a very minimal part of what I did, but that was in a different era. Now you need to have everything ready. So the first part of getting ready is inspiration, a favorite bookish character from TV or film, and Olive picked. She went straight to the Gilmore Girls, so she can go straight to the Gilmore Girls. I can go straight to Buffy, and of course that would be Giles, who is constantly urging his more action-oriented or video game-oriented young charges to read up on what they should know. And then part number 2 is travel agent, a favorite author outside of your demographic. And for this I have 2 fantastic writers of contemporary fiction. There's Thea Obrate, who wrote The Tiger's Wife, and there's Eleanor Catton, who wrote The Luminaries. Both books are hugely ambitious and atmospheric, and also have a very antic humor running throughout them. And the reason that both authors are outside of my demographic is because they are, in 2018, they are both 32, and I am 28. And then the next part is destination, a favorite place to read about. And when Olive got to this part, she sternly looked at the camera and said, of course, that would be Russia. And for me, I think, of course, it would be Venice. I lived in Venice. I've visited Venice many times. I love it dearly. And I love reading about it. It brings out the best in its writers. So that's what my answer is going to be. There'd be a number of... I love reading about a lot of the places where I've been. And then the last segment of part number 1 is Takeoff, which obviously refers to flying, which I have tried religiously not to do. Nowadays, since 2001, I don't do it because airports are traps. Because it's not just that when you get to the front of the line to board your plane, you must surrender all of your rights, legal and otherwise. It's not just that. It's that even entering the airport, the door of the trap closes behind you. Because if you get to the end of your line for the security check-in, and a bored gymnasium cop with an electronic wand picks you at random because his lunch didn't agree with him and says, well, what I need you to do is move over here. You're 5 feet away, but you're still in an easy view of everyone else in line, and strip down to your underwear. And if you point out to that officer, A, that's an unreasonable search. B, even if it were reasonable, you would need a signed warrant from a judge. And C, I absolutely am not going to strip my clothing off in public. Not only would you not be allowed to fly, but you could be arrested on the grounds of your refusal. The trap has already sprung when you go to the airport. So that since 2001, that's why I don't fly. And before that, before 2001, I tried not to fly for a very simple reason. Airplanes weigh 100 tons. You want to be 35,000 feet over the ground, something that weighs 100 tons. But anyway, I get the meaning of the part. Takeoff is a book you read to travel to a place you've never been. And I have never been to Australia. It's the only place in the world I've never been. And for that, I use The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, his big, thick history of Australia that a critic famously quipped years ago, everyone has, but no one has read. I have actually read it. I think it's tremendously compelling. I love it. And I use it, even though it's not about modern-day Australia. I use it just to dream about this place, this enormous, beautiful place where I will never be. Then part 2 is Out and About, which is when the trip is underway. And segment number 1 is Sights, a reading spot that you want to visit. And there are many, many, many places. These would be revisits for me. And the one that came first to mind is the public library at Woods Hole, which is beautiful. I don't know that, I mean, a reading spot to go and read seems a little indulgent to me, since I prefer to read in the company of my dogs. And you can't do that at most public libraries anymore. You used to be able to. I used to do that in Iowa. But it would be there. That sprang first to mind. It's just a lovely place. Maybe for an hour. My dogs probably wouldn't mind. Then Tastes, a food or drink you first encountered in a book. This would be one that doesn't exist. Spice wine. Spice cookies, spice wafers, anything infused with the melange from Frank Herbert's novel Dune, which when you get into the book just a little, you realize that on Dune, it's everything. The spice is in everything. It's in the air, it's in the water, it's in the food. You can't help, and it's highly addictive. So you really can't help but become addicted to it. But it tastes, we're told, vaguely of cinnamon, and I have a sweet tooth for cinnamon. The next section is Locals, a favorite foreign-to-you character in a book, and here it was a toss-up. And they weren't just foreign to me, these two characters, they're also foreign to their authors. Both authors had virtually no ability to write a convincing foreign character, but their plot needed someone to be foreign, so they make these weird creatures. The first is Anthony Trollope. In his great novel, The Way We Live Now, the main villain is a man named Melmotte, who we're not really sure where he comes from or what he is. No one can quite pin down the hint of an accent in his voice. No one knows anything about him, except that in Trollope's world, because he has no moral fiber, he can't possibly be English. And the other one is by Bram Stoker, and that's Van Helsing, Abraham Van Helsing from Dracula, who just totters on stage in a preposterous getup, and in preposterous pidgin English starts spooling out the most ridiculous nonsense about what Dracula may or may not be. If you take a step back from that novel, from the events of that novel, if you take a step back and take Van Helsing out of the equation for a minute and just think, what would the others, what would our band of men, our band of young men, and the one young woman involved, what in England, what would they think was going on? An abandoned ship crashes into shore. Crew are all dead, drained of blood. A wolf is seen running through the city streets. A child is found dead. What would they have thought? They would have come up with a whole bunch of rationales and acted on them. And more than likely ended Dracula's career anyway, even without knowing that he was a member of the undead, the king of the undead. Then this Van Helsing guy shows up and starts telling them stories that are in no way. He does it in such a ridiculous way. Again, I will recommend Wolf's book, the what is it? The authoritative, the annotated Dracula. I'll leave a note down below. I'm spacing on the name right now, but he did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He did Frankenstein, and especially he did Dracula, and it's just hilarious annotated edition of Dracula. Totally authoritative and comprehensive, but also so funny. And he is, at his funniest, constantly tripping up Abraham Van Helsing in the notes. I'll remember to leave a note down below, because I've written about it before. And then the next section is Sounds, and it is a word or phrase you learned in a book. And the book I have in mind, the series I have in mind, is The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, by Stephen Donaldson, an epic fantasy series that started from probably in the 70s. And one of the group of characters, it's mostly a heavy Tolkien pastiche. But one of the things that he comes up with that's original, one of the ideas in the books that isn't a ripoff of the elves or the Ents or the orcs or whatever, is the Blood Guard. There are people from the mountains. They're called the Harukai. And they swear service to the lords, the magicians, the wizards who run the mystical land in the books. And their vow of service is so extravagant that it binds them beyond the limits of the flesh. They don't sleep, they don't age, they don't eat. The Blood Guard they disdain weapons. They are living weapons on their own, masters of unarmed combat. And it's fun to watch them. throughout the books. First, the first 3 books, then there was a pause, then Donaldson did a second trilogy. And in the second trilogy, we meet what effectively is the god of the Blood Guard, the god of the Harukai. And it took me the better part of 20 minutes, probably 30 years ago, to memorize this character's name just so I wouldn't be tripping over it on the page. It's Akaru Ken Austin Ardenal. and that is definitely a word I learned while reading. And then the last 2 parts of this second segment are souvenirs. I brought almost no souvenirs back from any of my travels. And that was a conscious decision, not just pragmatically. There's nothing more useless in filling up extremely limited satchel space than souvenirs. Not only pragmatically, but also just, I guess you could say, philosophically. Because as a very wise person that I once knew told me about souvenirs, she said, they're really a gift you bring back to yourself. And because they're a gift that you bring back to yourself, they're an assumption or even a decision that you will be the same person. And why would you want to travel? What would be the point of traveling at all if you're intent already on coming back the same person? I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that. I've never really seen the point. I've never, very seldom would I was out of contact. When I traveled, I was usually out of contact. This was before the internet, so there was no contacting me. So friends couldn't say, hey, would you get me a piece of Limoges or whatever? So it would be a keepsake of my own. Most of them don't make any sense. And since most of the time I was traveling in the companionship of dogs, the keepsakes wouldn't have meant anything. None of it would have meant anything. So there are almost no photos. I think to the best of my knowledge, there are 4 existing photos taken by other people of me while traveling. And almost no souvenirs. You could, if you look through Hyde Cottage here, you'll see barely any. There's one from Wales. I think there's one from Africa, but other than that, no. But anyway, souvenir number 1 is a favorite bookstore you've been to. And I was going to be snotty here, but instead I'm going to stick true to the colors. I'm going to say the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's a great old used bookstore in the heart of old downtown Crossing that isn't like most used bookstores in that they very actively buy. So there's an enormous turnover of stock, enormous. So much so that if you see something there that you really want, you should get it because it likely won't be there the next time you go in. Their foot traffic is enormously good. And it's very different from, for instance, the Strand in New York City, where the turnover is, the books that supply the turnover, mainly for online orders, aren't always plucked right from the shelf. There's a vast storehouse of books that they can draw from. So that if you see, for instance, I don't even know, a big fat biography of Queen Victoria in hardcover, or the Jerusalem Bible in hardcover, or an annotated Andy Warhol in hardcover in the Strand on a Monday, you can be almost certain it will still be there on that Friday, and that is not always true of the Brattle. And I love it. I absolutely love it there. I used to go all the time. I used to go every day when my dogs, my 2 old girls, were very sick and very frail. Once I had seen to their needs, I knew that they were going to sleep for a long stretch of time and they wouldn't need me. And in order to restore my batteries for helping them, I would leave them every day. I would take all of their needs, settle them in the sun, and then go and shop at the Brattle just for fun, just browse at the Brattle. So much fun to do. Because in addition to the store, there's also the lot next door where there are sale books, $1, $3, and $5, and there are hundreds of them. So, and those change all the time too. So I used to do that. I used to go every day, and then my girls got really sick. They weren't just frail and weak. They were also incontinent and panicked by that. And that meant I couldn't leave them at all, so I didn't. And then they died, and I, in the meantime, got a puppy. And you can't leave a puppy alone. You'd be best advised not to. So I haven't done that either. And as a result, my attendance at the Brattle has sort of dropped off. But I still love it dearly. And then part number 2, souvenir part number 2, is a favorite library that you've been to. And again, I was going to be bratty here. I was going to say the Wethersfield Proctor Library, a tiny 1-room library in Vermont. Which I love, absolutely love, even though they have fewer books than virtually anybody on BookTube. Nevertheless, I was going to say that, but again, I'm going to stick with the home colors, and I'm going to say not just the Boston Public Library, but Bates Hall in the Boston Public Library, which was, for a long time, my absolute favorite place to go to work. I mean, I belong to another library, a private library here in Boston, and it is beautiful. It's the most beautiful building that I know of in America. But not always good for work, because I know a lot of people there. I'd go in and meet people. You go off to a quiet couch and talk, or you all that sort of stuff. Whereas in Bates Hall, if you Google Bates Hall, do an image search, you'll see what I mean. It's the real deal. It's a research library. The attendants will bring you the books that you ask for from the research stacks. And it's a place to work. It's a real good place to work. You're surrounded by people who are working. And I wrote a couple of novels in Bates Hall and enjoyed every minute of it. So I'm going to have to stick with the Boston Public Library, with great apologies for the Wethersfield Proctor Library. And then part 3 is Coming Home, which I traveled a lot, and I was gone for long periods of time. So coming home was always weird. It was always a weird feeling, especially during the travel experiences I had where I did not bring my own dogs, where my own dogs were being cared for back at home. Then coming home really had a weight to it. But most of the traveling I did either at a time when I had no dogs or with my own dogs. So coming home always felt strange. I was never constrained by work. I was never constrained by a lack of money. It was always kind of more or less a decision to come home. And that's strange. But anyway, part number 1 is Reunion, a book you bought or read to learn more about your hometown. And the hometown I'm going to invoke here is Boston. And I'm sorry, this is going to sound like a very snotty answer, but I have never read a book to learn more about Boston. Most of the books that I've read every book that I think that's ever been written about Boston. And none of them have... none of them have taught me anything about Boston that I didn't already know. I have walked every inch of the city. I know the biography of every brick, every crack in every street lamp, every window pane, every single thing, every dock piling, everything. I know it all from long experience of being here and watching it all and talking to people and absorbing through my pores almost. So I can't honestly say that I've ever read a book about Boston that taught me anything about Boston. And yet I love reading books about Boston, so I do recommend them. But I don't really have an effective answer here. And then the last question is, oops, a book of yours that went on its own adventure. That is a book you loaned out that was never returned, a book you lost or forgot somewhere. This has happened to me, of course. I lost a treasured Penguin classic that just fell into the ocean. It fell into the Indian Ocean. I couldn't reach it. I couldn't get it out. I'm perfectly happy to deal with waterlogged books, but I couldn't do it. And I've lost another copy of another Penguin classic, ripped out of my hands overboard during a storm in the North Atlantic. Just disintegrated in the air. But the book that I have in mind, the book that I have in mind was a Penguin classic of Gulliver's Travels. Ironically enough, a book about traveling. And I was reading it for the millionth time, and I was enjoying it like crazy. While I was involved in a long hike, a long trekking expedition through the jungles of the Congo, along the Congo River. And I was in the company of 2 very old friends and the current lover of one of those old friends, and 2 armed guards. We'd hired 2 guards, two guides with rifles, just in case, and to help with portage and whatnot. And the country at the time was called Zaire, and we were in a jungle clearing. The wilderness, it's horrific because it's boiling hot and it's full of bugs, but nevertheless, it is unearthly gorgeous. Just unearthly gorgeous. I don't even know what a Google image search would do for you because I don't know how much of it is gone. But I don't know. The jungles of Zaire were just gorgeous, and we had been trekking for a while. There'd been a lot of hooting and burping and garumphing in the foliage up above us and the hills beyond us, not up in the trees, but up on the flanks of the hills that we were flanking. It was obviously a troop of chimpanzees, and they weren't showing themselves, but they were obviously sticking with us because they were right. The sounds were right on us the whole time that we were moving. And the guides didn't think anything of it, and I didn't think anything of it. Of course, you have to be a little cautious because if you're raised on American movies and television, you'll think of chimpanzees as, you know, bulldog-sized animals. Those are baby chimpanzees. The adults are as big as humans and 5 times as strong and savage, like all primates. So you have to be a little cautious. But they're also really smart. They're usually not gonna cause trouble because they're vulnerable. You know, unlike, for instance, elsewhere in Africa, if you were to encounter a rhino on a dirty road in the middle of nowhere and you look down the road and there it is, well, then you're in real trouble because not only is it potentially dangerous, but it's not vulnerable. Same thing with an elephant. Oh my God, elephants are the worst. Not only because they're not vulnerable to anything you do, but also because they're as smart as you are, and often want to make trouble, especially the young males. But in this case, we weren't too worried, and we were in camp, and I was reading, and my dogs were all very quiet. And then one by one, the dogs' heads came up, all pointing in the exact same direction, the exact same wall of brush, and it started to move. The brush started to move. It was pretty obvious that we were going to be visited, that some members of this troop of chimpanzees had mustered the courage to come closer to camp. This was in daylight. This was a couple of hours before sunset. So, not that you can really tell when you're deep in the jungle as we were. You can't really. The sunset's more a theoretical thing. It's more a matter of ambient light than direct light. But I told my dogs to just calm down. I said, you know, it's no big deal. We'll just wait and see what happens. It was a good distance, and sure enough, heads started to appear. Chimps, a bunch of adolescents, probably 4 or 5 adolescents started to appear. They were just curious. They wanted to get closer and get a good look. They weren't territory marking. We were far away from their range, and they weren't aggressive or threatened in any way. They just were curious. They would egg each other forward to go a little bit further. I thought best to give them a little space, especially when a fairly big one cleared the brush almost completely and then went back in. I thought best to give them a little space, just see, they'll get bored, they'll move on. So I got up from my chair and I moved my dogs away, and I left Gulliver's Travels on the box that was next to my chair. And we moved a good distance away, and everybody now, all my old friends and the guides, we were all just watching. And sure enough, they came out of the brush and came closer to the chair. One of them was poking at the chair. One of them was poking at the box. One of them was poking at the book, this Penguin Classic, just poking at it because I'd touched it last. I imagine my traces were all over it, and it was a bit tense because they were keeping their eyes on us the whole time. And at one point, one of the guides actually raised his rifle and started to raise his voice. I said, "Shut up and put your gun down." And he and his friend turned on me, even though I was paying them 3 times their going wage. And I said, "If you raise that gun or fire at those animals, I'll have my dogs rip you apart." we were a long way from any kind of law enforcement. And by that point, in addition to my own dogs, I had also acquired dogs along the way, so I think the number was up to like 15 or 16. So an armed man would last probably 5 seconds, and he knew it. And he knew that I was serious, because, for God's sake. So we just stood and watched, but they must have sensed that he was alarmed, and they certainly recognized the gun, because they started to get really tense and make sort of adolescent, "oh, you know, I'm not afraid of you" gestures, and then decided discretion was the better part of valor and started retreating. But at the last minute, one of them turned around. He wheeled and turned around, ran back, and grabbed my book. And then just took off with it. It was like a gesture. But I have often wondered since, this was like 80 million years ago, all those dogs are gone, the guides are gone, those apes are all certainly gone. I've wondered many times since then what happened to that book. And whether or not it may be screwed up royally the mind of some future Jane Goodall who comes across the bedding site of a troop and finds a weather-beaten copy, much used, of Gulliver's Travels in Penguin Classic. What could this mean? I wish I could find that anthropologist and say, "It's mine." But anyway, that's the other. You were probably worried when you saw the name of this tag that you were going to get 80 million tedious travel stories, but you only got one. And now what's left is for me to tag people. And the idea is to tag someone in every compass direction from where you are. So I tried to do that. To the north would be Mark at Richardson Reads. And then to the west would be Jess at Garden Scriptorium. And then to the east, across the ocean, Steve Partridge. And finally, to the south, Elizabeth, my very own co-host of March Mystery Madness. And that's it for now. I'm going to wrap this up. This did make me feel better. So I'm gonna get out while the getting's good. But thank you very much, BookTube. I'll see you soon.